Welcome to our third midweek study in the book of Mark. In Mark chapter 8 verse 14, it begins like this. The disciples had forgotten to bring bread except for one loaf they had with them in the boat. Be careful, Jesus warned them. Watch out for the yeast of the Pharisees and that of Herod. They discussed this with one another and said, "It is because we have no bread." Sometimes I love the disciples because they say the most random things. Here's Jesus talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod, but they say it's because we have no bread. Now there's kind of two ways that people approach this. It's either that they didn't have enough bread, they only had one loaf in the boat, which was clearly not enough for 12 people and for whatever journey that they were going to do. And actually what was happening was that they just continued arguing about the lack of bread that they had and whose fault perhaps that was, so kind of ignoring what Jesus had said. The other is that they just go yeast, bread, and connected the two together and come up with that kind of statement. Well, either way, they're not really listening to what Jesus said. And it seems so random. Oh, it's because we have no bread. But let's not forget the disciples' journey. It's just constant, isn't it? They're seeing these most remarkable things that they're constantly left astonished at. And just now they've just been to the Decapolis, which is the 10 cities, which is where it's said that good Jewish boys go to get up to no good. It's kind of said that the prodigal son parable is based on the fact that Jewish boys did go off to the 10 cities of the Gentiles to get up to all kinds of debauchery. And they've just done that, and they've just seen miracles among the Gentiles, and they're about to head to Caesarea Philippi, which Pastor Mike talked about on Sunday, where there's worship of the god Pan, which is weird and not at all wonderful kinds of worship. So their heads would have been spinning, and they make this kind of statement. And now Jesus, it says in verse 17, he's aware of their discussion. So verse 17, aware of their discussion, Jesus asked them, "Why are you talking about having no bread? Do you still not see or understand? Are your hearts hardened? Do you have eyes but fail to see and ears but fail to hear? And don't you remember when I broke the 5 loaves for the 5,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? 12, they replied. And when I broke the 7 loaves for the 4,000, how many basketfuls of pieces did you pick up? They answered, 7. He said to them, do you still not understand? And I think this question, do you not understand, is a whole lot deeper than we give it credit. Because if I look at it and I'm saying, is he talking about the yeast of the Pharisees and Herod? We've got no bread. And he makes this connection with really strong language. Like, this is the language that he used of the Pharisees right back in chapter 3, where he says what's said of them is said in the prophets, that they have ears but they fail to hear, that they hear but don't understand, they see but don't perceive, etc. This really strong language now being used towards the disciples. And I'm like, I'm not sure I understand, Jesus. Can you just flesh it out a little bit? Like, just, do you still not understand? Here, let me explain it to you. But the story finishes there and heads into the next thing. There's this kids movie called Bedtime Stories. And we watched it with our kids many times, and our kids could actually recite part of it. But there's this part in it where at the end, Adam Sandler is giving an impassioned plea not to sell this hotel. And he's saying all the joys of the hotel, but unfortunately he's been bitten by a bee and he's allergic and his tongue has swollen up. So his mate, who is very clueless and I won't say, well, I will, the blonde of the story, which, sorry if you're blonde, but you know what I'm talking about, Russell Brand interprets for him because he says that he can understand him. So Adam Sandler's there and he says, and Russell Brand says, jumping up and down on the alligator. And Adam Sandler's like, repeats himself, and Russell says, going up and down on the elevator. I see now how alligators didn't really work in that context. And here we are in this passage, and it's all about context. It's all about context of what's just happened in terms of feeding the 5,000 and the 4,000, but it's also in terms of context of Israel's narrative, of Israel's scriptures. You see, Jesus is saying, bread's not the problem, guys. A lack of bread is not the problem. I've shown you, if you're worried about a lack of bread, I'm your guy. You want pan de casa, I'm your person. You want some sourdough, I've got that covered. You want some Turkish, I'm your person as well. You want manna in the desert, I am your person. Pause for dramatic effect. If you want manna in the desert, I did that too. Jesus is saying, connect the two things, boys. Feeding the people, providing bread from nowhere. Who else has done that? None but the person that you praise and adore and generation upon generation have worshipped, because even the wind and the seas obeyed him as he brought you out of the Red Sea, and then he fed you in the wilderness. Bread is not the problem because of who I am. He's saying the one that you've been talking about, the one about whom you memorize Torah, the one who you speak of, is right here among you. Now, Jesus has repeated on the miracles that he did amongst the Jews. He's now repeated them amongst the Gentiles and jumped in the boat, because the Pharisees have said, even after all that, they've said, give us a sign. He said, I'm not going to give you a sign. Jumps in the boat and they head off again. And then he says, beware of the yeast of the Pharisees and of Herod. Well, the Pharisees just fail to understand who Jesus is. They just see everything that's going on. They hear the teaching with authority and are amazed, and they continue to ask for a sign. And Herod has just killed John the Baptist, who is the messenger who was to prepare the way of the Lord. And so Jesus is saying, beware of this kind of yeast of your brothers who with such pride and self-deceit fail to understand who I am. And he's saying, you're arguing about bread. You are at risk of this very same pride and self-deceit. So for us, let's not be found in the same camp. May we recognize who Jesus is in the midst of our situation. May we not be betrayed by our conversations or our doubts, that we think he is less than who he actually is. May we have aligned ourselves with the powerful and magnificent Son of God and work in full confidence moving forward, knowing that he is able, that he is willing, and that he is desperate to move on behalf of his people as we have the soft and malleable hearts towards him.